Okay. Well, thank you very much for having Andy and me here. Um, what we're going to do is uh, introduce how to look at flycatchers, and the first half I will present, and then Andy will take the second half and close. The second half will be more about specific flycatchers, and we've tweaked it so that it has an Eastern slant to it. And and we don't know exactly the background of everyone here, but I assume there are some beginners and some hardcore howdy experienced birders. And so our talk is kind of it should be appeal to both sides, or at least we hope it does. And so as Navid said, we have uh, published two books on flycatchers. The first one is on Empidonax and pewees, really one of the toughest ID complexes in North America. And then the other one is kingbirds and Myiarchus, which actually Andy and I think they might even be tougher under certain conditions. But today we'll focus mostly on Empidonax and pewees, and we'll touch a little bit on volume three, just little hints of what is going to show up in volume three. That will be more Andy than me. Um, so the first volume is it's a small book if you haven't gotten it, can fit in your pocket, and it's like 200 pages, and it only considers these species. It doesn't look like a lot of species, but the reason why we dedicated a whole book to this is because they are so difficult to identify. And so we discuss all the nuances and details of identifying these. And the same thing goes with kingbirds and Myiarchus. Volume three will actually include all of these. So this is the genus Myiarchus and Tyrannus, but we're going down to northern Mexico and of course the United States. Be one and two combined with additional flycatchers that weren't covered in volume one and two. And then, of course, a lot more in depth on uh, details that we've since discovered. So feel free to put comments into the chat, and we'll address them at the end, I think, if we have time. But I wanted to start with these two photos. And normally, when we're in person, we'll interact with the audience and ask you what you think about these. We purposely didn't put the names. The names aren't so important. We just wanted to show you, well, these are both flycatchers. And if you take a moment to look at them, do you see anything what are the similarities and what are the differences? Of course, they all look like they have sort of a long tail, long bill, a peak on the head, a little bit of an eye ring. This one has maybe just barely an eye ring. Different wing bar, they both have wing bars. So in that sense, all these flycatchers look the same. And so if you go out and see a flycatcher and you come back and say, I saw wing bars or I saw a long tail, that's not particularly useful for separating within the flycatcher group. But if you look more carefully, you'll see, this one has bold wing bars, and this one to the right has duller wing bars. Structurally, they're a little bit different. This is a bit more vertical posture than the one to the left. Underparts, this one has very bright underparts, uh, and this one a little darker underparts. They both kind of look green. And what else? This one looks like it has a bigger head. So there are subtle differences. And what we're going to try to do is get you well, all of us, to come up with some sort of common language, a standardized way of looking at flycatchers, engaging or evaluating these subtle features. Now, if you haven't um, spent a lot of time with flycatchers, you might feel a bit intimidated by them. Like there are all these brown birds that can't be identified, and they are tough. But I put this comparison slide up, which we are familiar with. Cattle egret, snow egret, great egret, and they're all white. But we all know, we can see the differences in here. Structurally, this one has a shorter neck, all the way to the great egret with a much longer neck, like a snake. There's a difference in the bill size. There's a difference, of course, in the color of the bill, and even in dark light. If you can't see color, you'll see there's a contrast of a dark bill with a white face or plumage, and here's a lighter bill and a light plumage. So if you can see this, or these differences in our waders here, then in theory, your eyes really are already capable of seeing differences in flycatchers. We just have to fine tune what you already inherently know how to do. And that's what the first third of both of our books are about, is just how to look at a flycatcher. So coming back to flycatchers, one of the things we de-emphasize when looking at flycatchers is color. So I purposely took out the color here, all gray toned here. And again, it's not important to know the names of these. What I want you to focus on is that what might be some of the differences. And again, they all kind of look similar, but if you look more carefully, you'll see, oh, this one has a light chest and a dark back. And here, although it may be overexposed, you see there's little contrast between here and here. Um, Differences in contrast in the wing bars, differences in the relative lengths of the tails, primary projection. And we're going to go through all of this. And once you start to see these things, you start to notice that these are actually quite different birds. And that's what we like to get at. And we'll walk you through that so we can develop a common language in terms of what is a long tail, what is a medium tail, because everyone has a different uh, impression when they see out there. And one person's long tail could be someone's medium tail. So one of the things we don't emphasize color. We're going to emphasize plumage contrast, but one of the biggest challenges with flycatchers is that really there's not many field marks that by themselves are diagnostic, and each of these field marks on a flycatcher tend to have a lot of variation, and there's overlap. And so if you rely always on one field mark, you're likely to make a lot of misidentifications. However, if you put a lot of these things together, we think about this as a more holistic style of birding, that combination of different field marks, variable field marks, combined with vocalizations, habitat, behavior, and even migratory or seasonal status, those can really help you get to maybe 90% of the identifications correct. There will always be some that you can't identify, and Andy and I, we're not embarrassed to say sometimes just leave that bird alone and leave it as an Empid spa. And it's okay to make mistakes. We still make mistakes ourselves. The main thing is, what do you do when a flycatcher pops up in front of you and you've only got 30 seconds to look at it? What do you look at? So I'll go through a few. We're not going to be exhaustive because we don't have that much time, but we'll go through some of these uh, more important features. And one of them that you've probably heard a lot about is this primary projection. And what that is so the wing is composed of these flight feathers here. You have on the folded wing the secondaries, which are the inner flight feathers, and then the ones that protrude out are the primaries. They're the outer wing. And the extent to which it protrudes out is what we call the primary projection, which you can see more schematically with Andy's plates here. And the way we measure it, this can actually be quantifiable, is sort of the ratio of this projection relative to the longest tertial. And by that, I mean the longest tertial to where the greater coverage or the lower wing bar is. And so you can see from around here that some have a short primary projection, some have a long. You can go to a pewee and look how that primary projection is almost as long as the longest tertial, whereas a least flycatcher, it's significantly shorter or less than half the length of the longest tertial. And then you have birds that are somewhat intermediate. And in the book, we will tell you, which flycatchers fall into these classes. Of course, there's overlap. So, but this, you would take the book, you see a bird, compare it to this essentially this guide right here in the ruler, so you can decide is it long or is it somewhere between long and medium, and just mark that, in your notes as a mental note or when you're taking notes, field notes. And prime projection, we often look at first because it is generally an easy thing to assess in the field, and it is probably the best thing to do if you don't want to make a mistake of identifying a wood pewee, say, as an Empidonax or vice versa. And so pewees, they all have very long primary projections, whereas Empidonax all have much shorter relative to the pewees. The only exception is the Cadian, which might somewhat approach that of a pewee. And so here I put one of Andy's plates, willow flycatcher versus wood pewee, and willows are dull empids, and they very often look like pewees, but look at that primary projection, very different feature. So we always look at that first. The other thing that we often look at when you have a split second view of a flycatcher, and you can see this quickly, is what we call upper underpart contrast. And that's really looking at the throat, the chest, and the belly together as one or different parts, and comparing it to the upper parts, the crown or the face. The face is a good place to compare. And you can see that in the fleece flycatcher, for example, in Acadian that you get in the east, you have a strong upper part, lower part contrast. And then most of the flycatchers of the west have a weak contrast. And the only one in the east that has a weak contrast between the upper and lower is the yellow-bellied. And then your other ones are typically very strong contrast right here. So when you see a bird in a flycatcher out in the east that in the winter, let's say, when it's not supposed to be there, but it has low contrast between upper and under, either yellow-bellied, which is highly unlikely because there are almost no winter yellow-bellied records, but it might be a wayward flycatcher from the west, like a Hammond's or maybe a dusky or even gray, which have strayed as far east as where you all are. Bill size or bill shape is something to hone in on. There's a lot of overlap between these, but at the extremes, you'll get the short versus the long. A gray flycatcher and has a long bill. Pewees have long bills, and least flycatcher and Hammonds and yellow-bellieds are somewhere. Yellow-bellied be somewhere in between. Again, a lot of overlap, but at the extremes, it can be useful. Here's a long one on an Acadian and a short to medium one on a least flycatcher. Wing bars. How bold are the wing bars? Do they really stand out or pop out? And the way we assess that is compare the wing bar color or intensity, I guess, to the mantle. And so you'll see some where it's about the same color as the mantle, and some where it's a lot brighter than the mantle in these illustrations. And you can see here for least and Acadian, most pretty much eastern empids have very strong wing bar contrast. See how white it is, or it didn't show yellow-bellied, but Andy will show that. But you go look at the flycatchers of the west, gray and dusky, and Hammonds. They don't stand out relative to the wing or the mantle. You can barely see this wing bar in the gray. Now, you don't probably have to worry too much about that in the east, but you never know. Tail length. Again, a lot of overlap here, but at the extremes it's very useful. Hammonds at least have short tails, and of course you have the um, uh, well, gray flycatcher and pewees have somewhat longer tails, and then a bunch that are somewhat intermediate that do not aren't particularly diagnostic. But if you use that in combination with if you use that in combination with another potential feature, which is the width of the tail, then it becomes more powerful. So some Empidonax have narrow tails that often will pinch inwards towards the body. You see this right here. And that's like least and yellow-bellied and Hammonds. And then others have wide tails. And surprisingly, you can see this even if the bird is turned towards the side. It has a very different feel to it. The pewees all have wide tails, but willow, alder, and Acadian, they're the Empidonax that have wide tails. So again, a bird can move its tail feathers, so you have to be careful. You got to take a lot of pictures or watch this bird as it moves around, so you don't get tricked by one instantaneous snapshot uh, that you happen to see. But I put these here just to show you an example of narrow and short and long sorts of tails. Look at the gray, has a long and narrow tail. Hammonds and least have short and narrow tails, but alder, look how wide that tail is, and it's a medium length tail. So just showing you that you can see this feature. Eye ring is important. All these flycatchers have an eye ring, or in some occasions a very indistinct eye ring, and that's the problem because most of them have an eye ring. uh, you have to really look carefully at what is the nature of that eye ring. So you can go from what we call messy, and maybe we will use a different term for that in the third volume, but the main thing here, like for Elise, is that the thickness of the eye ring is not uniform around. It's thicker here sometimes it's thicker below, it's just not uniform around. You compare that to an Acadian or a yellow-bellied where it's perfectly uniform around and the borders are crisply demarcated from the rest of the face. So it's a really smart looking bird, and this is we call this a messy looking eye ring. And then you'll have indistinct eye rings where maybe part of it is missing and it's thin. This would be like willow and alder, and to some extent dusky. And you can see that here. See the least big, broad, Acadian, nice and crisp, alder somewhere in between, or thin. Other features to look at are wing panel contrast. This is a feature that probably isn't in the mainstream yet. It's a little bit more subtle, but it goes back to that the folded wing has the secondaries and the primaries, and refer to these things as panels. And the secondaries all have white edges to them. You see that? All these white edges. And the primaries, sometimes they have pale or whitish edges, as in gray, but you look at least or yellow belly, they don't really have distinct pale edges to the primaries. And so if you just take a step back, look at the bird from afar, you would say the gray, for example, would have low contrast between the primary panel and the secondary panel, but then you go to least, the primary panel looks pretty dark, and the least will have all these white stripes. Same thing with the yellow-bellied, or it would have more yellowish stripes. And the flycatchers on the East Coast or Eastern North America all have strong wing panel contrast in general, and flycatchers of the West tend to have weaker wing panel contrast. Again, there's variation in this, and wear and tear on the feathers can influence this. So I would never use this by itself, but the goal is to try to focus on all these features and come up with a combination of field marks to take a look at. Crown shape. We know that crown shape can vary on a bird depending on its posture and if it's agitated or excited, but the average state of the crown can be useful. Obviously, the Western flycatcher has a crest. Various flycatchers have somewhat of a peak, and then others tend to be more rounded, like least and yellow-bellied flycatcher. And then, gray flycatcher is very flat. Here's the rounds of the least. Here's the crest of the Acadian. And there's more that is in the book, but we won't touch on all of those. But I did want to touch on something that Andy and I have been working on. We're not going to go into detail on this, but we will hint at it at the very end when Andy talks about willow and alder and yellow-bellied and Acadian. But volume three actually will include a lot of measurements that we've made over the years that are not in volume one. Volume one was made to be more, we tried not to be technical. Volume three will have everything you ever want to know, all the technical aspects. And one of the interesting things that we found is that the spacings of the primary tips, or the relative spacings, actually can be quite diagnostic as long as you can rule out certain species. So some of you may be familiar with using this when you're trying to separate Pacific and American golden plovers, for example. But it turns out they're very useful for flycatchers, and especially if you can take photos of them. So we'll return to that and come back to that. There's other features um, about the primary tip spacings that are useful, but also the shape of the primaries. Um, you know, willow and alders. If you look at the outer primaries, the outermost ones often are emarginated, where they kind of have a cleft here and they bulge outwards. Um, and in the case of willow and alder, the seventh one is emarginated, but the sixth one is not. Whereas at least six and seven are emarginated. You probably, we probably want this is probably too much. Probably didn't want to know that much, but Andy will show you a little bit of this. Of even though it looks incredibly technical, it is accessible and it can be very useful. But I give you this hint so you're not surprised when Andy starts talking about it. So we just finished with the visuals, all these visual cues of structures, contrast. Didn't talk about color, so we're looking at contrast, relative proportions. But you always want to, if you can, couple this with vocalizations. And today, even with the iPhone, you can record. We're all doing that with Merlin. And actually, Merlin is pretty darn good with identifying flycatchers by vocalizations. In the book, the vocalizations are converted to these frequency time domain here, so spectrograms, and so that you have a visual to describe what you hear. That helps you learn these more quickly. And it also, again, standardizes among all of us what is a whit and what is a pip. We've seen out in the field that you can describe in the book this bird gives a pip, but what does that actually mean if you've never heard pip? So figures like this can help you cue in onto those differences. The other important feature to, it's subtle, but pay attention to is habitat, including microhabitat. On breeding grounds, the flycatchers are quite loyal to certain types of habitats. Um, these, unfortunately, are more habitats of the West, but you'll get things like gray flycatcher that'll be in really open pine, sagebrush type forest, whereas you get dusky flycatcher in open ponderosa pine forest, and then something like a western flycatcher or a yellow-bellied flycatcher or an Acadian, they're going to be in the shade. You rarely will find them out in open environments. They like the shade. Acadian in particular not only likes the shade, but tends to be near water bodies. Um, and even when they migrate, they tend to have some loyalty to this sort of habitat as you won't find the yellow-bellied flying out in the on the edge of a field and perched out on a barbed wire fence. Least may occasionally do that, but not yellow-bellied. So note that. The other thing to note is, of course, when you see it and where you see it, and compare that to what we know about their migratory patterns. Is it out of range? Obviously, you should be scrutinizing carefully, but is it out of season? And in the case of, say, yellow-bellied, we know that they don't actually enter the United States until May, uh, whereas eastern wood pewee arrives a little earlier. And in Texas, everyone comes down to Texas in spring, in April, to see the big migrations, and everyone wants to see a yellow-bellied flycatcher at High Island, and we get reports, but they're all likely to be mistaken. And I'll show you that this is the eBird record of yellow-bellied flycatcher in the spring for Texas. But after inspecting every single photo of yellow-bellieds in Texas up until 2024, we find that the earliest record is May 3rd. So it's quite likely all of these are misidentified. And we found many that, well, people were identifying eastern wood pewees as or Acadians as yellow-bellied, especially under the shade, everything looks yellow. And if you remember the first two photos I showed you, um, I did that on purpose. They were all sort of yellowish in color, and there was an eastern wood pewee there that looked very yellow that could easily have been misidentified if you just focus on color as a yellow-bellied. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy. There's this similarity map that we put in the book, and it was mainly to show in some sort of visual uh, where you're going to have your headaches. For example, if you saw a least flycatcher, or if you were looking at least flycatcher, you're likely to have issues comparing it to or separating it from alder. So the closer they are to each other, more likely they're going to be confused. Yellow-bellied and Hammonds, again, not something you worry about here. But something like a gray flycatcher is unlikely to be confused with a least. A least is unlikely to be confused with a wood pewee, but a willow flycatcher obviously overlaps with alder, tough ID problem, but also can be confused with a wood pewee. So that's just to help you figure out what you're up against, and there you go. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy now to take the second half and just close, and he'll close with a hint of what's to come in volume three.
Thank you. So we'll look at some of the species that you're probably looking at as we speak when you're out birding, and just some of the sort of key things you should look out for to sort of help you separate them. Here we have, the pewees, the Cantopus, which is olive-sided, and western wood pewee. I'm sure many of you are sort of familiar with the underparts of those two species tend to be quite vested and brown. But that can also occur on species like willow flycatchers. You can actually get some sort of willows that are quite sort of dirty on the underparts, kind of with a vest. Willow flycatcher also has a pretty plain face, not a big eye ring. Sometimes it's a minimal eye ring or none at all. Sometimes it can look a little crested. And so this is actually a common confusion species is the trails flycatchers, particularly willow with olive-sided or western wood pewee. So like Cin-Ty had mentioned, we really want to focus on primary projection here. This is something that's usually very visible in the field. I think, we should say with a lot of what we're going to talk about today, photography's a huge part of it. I think most of us now have, point and shoot cameras at the very least. Many of us have something much better. And sometimes maybe your first reaction might be take a quick look at it and then try and get as many photos as possible, because you will be able to look at those when you get back home, and you can study things like primary projection and see these sort of features quite easily and quite well on digital photos, even if they're not particularly good photos. So we'll see here that, the primary projection is a huge part of separating these two. In addition to some of the plumage features, generally willow flycatcher also has slightly bolder wing bars, but sometimes I'll see willows sitting right up at the tops of trees, and I'm seeing them from below, and I have a moment where I'm not totally sure if it's a wood pewee or not. But usually you can come to the correct identification by a combination of these features. Let's go on to the next slide. So, here we have, we have a good test of that. We have a pewee on the left-hand side here. Notice those long primaries that Cin-Ty will highlight there versus the willow flycatcher over on the right here. Much shorter primaries. You can actually quite easily see this even in a brief view. Notice the bolder wing bars of the willow. And versus the pewees, slightly duller. Those are usually wash, sort of rather dingy. And the underparts on the pewee, you can't see it too well on this photo, but generally they tend to have a bit of a vest, a little bit more dingy. Let's go on to the next one. So least flycatcher. I feel like I tend to liken this to the herring gull of the flycatcher world. It's very variable, but quite common. But certainly quite a variable looking bird. As Cin-Ty had sort of mentioned, in his sort of introduction, it's sort of your quintessential Empidonax. It's got wing bars, it's got an eye ring, it's fairly white below, it's fairly sort of bold and contrasting. Fortunately, they can be quite vocal. They make this whit call. constantly on the move. Often you hear them before you see them. So that's quite helpful. And they're a bird that's sort of medium in many respects. It's not a particularly, doesn't have a particularly long primary projection, doesn't have a particularly long tail, doesn't have an especially bold eye ring necessarily. So it checks the medium box in a lot of areas. But it's a species that obviously you're probably all quite familiar with as you're birding. If you look at the range map there, it's a species that's sort of not arriving in your area till sort of in the spring, until sort of late April, I suppose. In the fall, obviously you're right in the thick of it now, with probably many birds passing through as they head towards their wintering grounds in Central America. Let's go to the next slide. Here's some photos. This is sort of a quintessential least. They don't always look as striking as this, but in spring, which is when this bird was photographed, they're quite an attractive bird, really. They have a fairly smallish bill, the fairly sort of thick eye ring, that can be a bit messy around the edges, particularly at the rear. The wing bars are fairly bold, and that primary projection is sort of short to medium, not particularly obvious. Certainly nothing like a pewee. Notice that rather sort of short, narrow tail, and that's actually quite important because I think Cin-Ty had mentioned in the similarity map, least and order are very close to each other. And in fact, those two can be a real problem. So if you've got good photographs, I know you may have looked at some of those close-ups of the primaries and thought, well, that's no use to me. It's only of use to a bander. It's not actually the case anymore. Many people have photography equipment that can get you exceptionally detailed. So if you look very close at this blown up image of the wing here, we can actually count the primaries. And then there is something called emargination, which is it's kind of like a notch in the primaries. It can be sometimes quite hard to see, but since he's pointing it out here, we can actually count the primaries and see that there's a little notch on primary 6, which means that it's not an alder. Alder flycatcher does not have that. That has it on primary 7. So it may feel like we're getting into minutia here that's way out of your scope, but it's not true. You can actually sometimes see this with good photographs. And then, as I mentioned, here's a spectrogram of those calls. They have quite a sharp wit call, and in spring give a Quebec song as well. Go to the next slide. Acadian flycatcher, another sort of boldly marked wing-barred flycatcher. This one tends to have quite a large bill compared to the least flycatcher. It tends to have a more shallow, sort of sloping forehead, and also tends to have quite long primary projection compared to least flycatcher. This is probably one of the longer Empidonax flycatcher wings. There is some overlap with many of these species, but in general, this is the flycatcher that has quite long wings, sometimes even approaching wood pewee, but not quite that long. It tends to be very full of lots of contrast between the underparts and the upper parts. And it tends to have quite a neat eye ring, quite a narrow, neat eye ring compared to the sort of messier eye ring that you might get on a least flycatcher. It tends to also have quite a wide tail as well. And so in that regard might be confused with a willow or an alder. But generally is a brighter bird than those two, and often more colorful on the underparts, but we'll look at some actual photos of these species in a second here. In terms of its sort of range map and distribution, we're actually we're right in the midst now of trying to true up what its real migration routes are. There's actually a vast amount of what we believe is incorrect data in eBird. Entire states along the southern edge of the US are having incorrect entries for Acadian flycatcher and yellow-bellied flycatcher. And I think we're starting to see what the true status is and what the true migration routes are. But in general, Acadian flycatcher is migrating further east and going through Florida and then jumping across the islands to reach its wintering grounds in Central America and northern South America. Whereas yellow-bellied seems to be taking a more westerly route, going sort of through Texas to its wintering grounds. And we're still in the midst of trying to figure this out. We're in a lot of conversations with eBird reviewers in all of these states, who all seem quite happy and willing to help maybe clean up some of the data so we can actually sort of figure out what's going on with some of these species. Let's go to the next one. Here's an actual photo of an Acadian, just showing you in real life some of the stuff that we've talked about. Notice how long that primary projection is. And also notice there's something very unique about the primary spacing. They tend to have this very long primary 7 with a big gap there. It's not evenly spaced. That's a good feature of Acadian flycatcher. Again, we've got this sort of sloping forehead, quite a long bill, a rather neat, crisp eye ring. In spring, they're quite white below generally. In fall, the young birds, the hatchier birds especially, get very green and quite colourful on the underparts, which makes them a real problem to separate from yellow-bellied flycatcher. And so here is yellow-bellied. Generally, it lives up to its name. It's quite colorful on the underparts. It has a yellowish belly. But in fall, we need to be careful. Young trails flycatchers, especially young Acadians, can also be quite yellow. Certainly you can see least flycatchers with a yellowish wash to the underparts. So, not every bird that has yellow on its underparts is a yellow-bellied. In general, yellow-bellied will have a yellowish throat, which least flycatcher won't have. So if you come across a bird with a whitish throat that contrasts with the rest of its underparts, it's most likely to be a least rather than a yellow-bellied. Yellow-bellied is an interesting bird in terms of you can use status and distribution to really help you identify it. So if it's April and you're out birding in your favorite area up there, the chances are very high you're not looking at a yellow-bellied flycatcher. As Cin-Ty mentioned at the beginning of this talk, they don't actually start arriving in the US until the very beginning of May. And in fact, they're still on their wintering grounds in April. And so that is another area that I think, we're only just starting to learn and understand as we're looking at the data in eBird, that there's a lot of misidentifications of yellow-bellied in spring. And so, you can definitely use this map to help you. The map, because these are quite small books, we actually have a full page for each map. Just to sort of highlight here, the map will tell you each week. So here on the spring migration, we can see by the very beginning of May, you see the words May there written on the map. That's when the first birds start arriving. The dotted lines above that are the next week in May. And then you can see where you are in Delaware. It's not until the third week of May that you really start to see yellow-bellied. So if you're seeing them prior to that, you might want to take some precaution to really make sure you feel confident about the identification. In the fall, it's a little less easy in that regard. The dates are a lot more fluid, but generally in the spring, these birds are very faithful to their dates. Let's go on to the next slide. Here's a photo of one. This is actually one that was chosen that's not particularly yellow and colorful. It's in the shade, but it's actually kind of pale. And you might look at this and wonder how I could possibly separate it from a least. And that's a good question. It has a slightly longer primary projection. Its eye ring is usually a little more complete, crisp and round, whereas least a little more messy and incomplete. It has weaker upper and underpart contrast compared to a least. You can kind of see there that between the ears and the throat, there's not a lot of contrast there. Probably, I suspect if this bird was to faces, it would probably have a little more color on the throat. And there might be some trick of light making it a little white-throated, but generally there's not a lot of contrast there between the upper parts and the underparts on yellow-bellied. You can see here the primary projection. We're calling it a medium length, but it does actually get quite similar to Acadian flycatcher and can be quite a difficult identification to make. Let's go on to the next one. Here we have these three troublesome species together. We have Acadian up at the top left, and then a yellow-bellied, and then a least. You can see the sort of difference between the upper and underpart contrast on least and Acadian versus yellow-bellied. Slight difference in eye-ring, that sort of complete eye-ring on a yellow-bellied. It's a little less complete on the least, a little more messy at the rear. Acadian tends to have these thick, bold wing bars. You see that lower wing bar there is quite thick and squared off. If we look at the primary projection there, it's a little longer on that Acadian than it is on the yellow-bellied or even perhaps the least. Look at the tail width on the least there. It's a little, you can see it's quite narrow compared to the Acadian top left. So there's lots of little clues on how to separate these species. On the illustrations on the right here, I'm just illustrating how, even a colorful least, a full hatch-ear least that's got some yellow on its underparts, tends to have a more contrasting whiter throat versus the yellow-bellied that tends to have a throat color that's much more similar to its sort of face and ear. Okay, next one. Here's some photos. Least on the left, yellow-bellied and Acadian. Quite a long-billed bird, that Acadian. Nice complete eye ring, quite long primary projection, quite a wide tail, slightly thicker, bolder wing bar. Yellow-bellied's in the middle here. You can see that throat on that yellow-bellied is quite yellowish and greenish, not a lot of contrast between the throat and the rest of the face. And here on a least, you can see sort of quite a pale whitish throat. All of these species have, generally have bold contrasting wings. And I think I mentioned the tail. Yeah, the tail's wider there. And slightly sort of steeper forehead on the Acadian. So it's back to the sort of one of the first slides, which is holistic birding. There's no single feature we're looking at. We're looking at a combination of features. There can be overlap on many of these features. Let's go to the next slide. Alder flycatcher. It's long been assumed that you cannot separate alder flycatcher and willow flycatcher without hearing them sing. And usually the refrain is, they can't be identified in the hand, so they can never be identified in the field. And I think we're sort of challenging that notion that they can, in fact, be identified in the field. Of course, you always want to hear vocalizations, but even that can sometimes be difficult. It's not advertised in any of the field guides generally, but willow flycatcher also makes a pip call. Just like alder flycatcher. And I think, generally the field guides tend to emphasize that willow goes wit and alder goes pip, and that's the difference. But in fact, willow does also pip. So even hearing it may not be foolproof, but there are plumage features and there are structural features. In general, I think, a lot of birders who are used to seeing both species are familiar that alder tends to be a more contrasting bird with more contrasting wing bars and a neat eye ring, but there are also structural clues for how to separate them. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay. The big confusion, as we've mentioned, one of the big confusions with alder flycatcher can be least flycatcher. Very, very similar in terms of plumage contrasts, but least tends to have a shorter primary projection, tends to have a slightly narrower tail, tends to be smaller billed as well. If you get a very good photograph, least has a margination on primary 6, whereas alder does not. Here's a photograph, the gray drawings on the left here, just kind of highlighting, the smaller bill shape, the generally smaller structure of the bird that can often be quite apparent. Here's a quite a worn looking alder flycatcher from the spring, highlighting some of these features. It looks fairly nondescript, but there are some structural clues here. There is a difference in how the primary spacing is between alder and least and willow, and we'll look at that, I think, in the next slide. It tends to have quite a wide tail there. It's a little bit worn. We can see actually, yeah, that next slide's good because we can see least and yellow-bellied next to it. Not a particularly colorful bird, alder flycatcher, but it does have a lot of contrasts with it. It's kind of got like a khaki, sort of darker sort of upper parts. Least this photograph here, it does have a wider tail. It's sort of in tail molt, but generally they'll have a wider tail and a bigger bill. I would say it's sort of fairly clear from these photos that the alder is the bigger billed bird out of all of them. Quite a nondescript eye-ring as well. It can be very small and faint. But usually it's a sort of complete eye ring that encircles the eye, and tends to be sort of, compared to least flycatcher, tends to have slightly longer primary projection. Let's go to the next one. So willow flycatcher, super similar to alder. The trails flycatcher group, as I said, for a long time were considered inseparable and really only became species in sort of fairly recent history. When it was discovered that the vocals, the songs, and the calls were significantly different. In our book here, we actually show the difference between a willow flycatcher pip call versus a alder pip call. There is a slight difference. If you get a recording on Merlin and save it, it will show you the difference in the spectrogram. But willow, again, is another sort of somewhat nondescript species with a thin eye ring. Again, really pay close attention to the maps. This can be where you are and when you are watching the bird can be as important as how the bird looks. Status and distribution for some of these species is probably one of the most important things. So again, willow flycatcher tends to be a late migrant, showing up, in your area, not until I'm not sure of the exact date, but you'll be looking at late April, early May. Here in Southern California, they don't show up until the very beginning of May. And pretty much you can take it to the bank that if you think you've seen a willow flycatcher in April, you probably haven't, especially if it's mid-April. So definitely use the status and distribution here. You can see that black line across that spring map is sort of a rough approximation of when they are in your area by which date, and then the dotted lines above each one are the weeks of those months where they show. Let's go on to the next. So here we have just examples of what we talked about with willow: fairly broad, wide tail, medium length primary projection, fairly dull eye ring, fairly heavy bill bird. Again, notice the primary six is not homogeneated, whereas it would be on least flycatcher. Let's go on to the next one. And so this is something we published recently in Western Birds. Cin-Ty did a very deep dive, museum dive on alder and willow flycatcher. And there are relative differences in the ratios of how the primaries are spaced between each species. That has a very high degree of reliability in the field. It does not require you having to trap the bird if you have good photos. And we've seen it, it's helped to clarify identification of vagrant alders out here in the West that have been silent birds. They've checked all the boxes for how they look in terms of bold wing bars and eye rings and general coloration. The primary spacing has helped sort of seal the deal. yes, we just published this recently, so we sort of feel like it's going to be very helpful for observers to be able to actually separate alder and willow flycatcher without actually being in the breeding range or hearing them sing or even having to hear them call. Here it is in action. We have an alder on the left and a willow. This is actually sort of quite a bold, contrasting willow with a fairly sort of round, flat head. You could certainly say these two basically look identical, and I wouldn't argue with you on that. Um, I think when you zoom in on the images here, we're going to show you what the differences are. So you can actually count the primaries. The primary 5 and 6 tends to, on alder, be a smaller gap than 6 to 7. You can see it with the naked eye here. Whereas it's the reverse on willow, whereas 5 to 6 tends to be longer than 6 to 7. We did find some small amount of overlap, and I think there always needs to be some caution when applying this in the field. Birds can obviously shuffle their feathers, the angle could produce foreshortening, so there is some care that you should definitely apply. But under many field conditions, it does seem to work out quite well. Here's another view of that as well, just showing the alder on the left there, with that long gap between 6 and 7 is longer than the 6 and 5 gap. We can confirm it's an alder and not a least. P7 is emarginated, P6 isn't. You can see the emargination on the willow on the right there. We actually got a little white arrow pointing. You see that sort of notch. You see how the feather sort of widens at that point there. That's emargination. So again, that's helpful to separate it from least, to know that we're looking at a trails. And then yes, you can see on the willow P5 to 6 is bigger than the gap of 7 to 6, which is opposite of what you get on alder. Next slide. Here we have a couple in the hand. We have an alder on the left showing that difference with a willow on the right. Eastern willow, should add. Next slide. And then as we touched on earlier, we're really diving into the yellow-bellied flycatcher, Acadian flycatcher problem. Super similar species, particularly in the fall when you get some very greenish yellow Acadians. And this bird particularly, I think, kind of sparked it. Recently, a photographer submitted this bird, and there was questions about, well, why isn't it an Acadian? And there's a number of features. The primary spacing we looked at is different between yellow-bellied and Acadian. This bird has slightly different shape to its greater coverts. They're kind of like thinner, and the dark bases a little more spade-shaped. That's different from Acadian. So it then got everybody looking at all of their photos. and chaos ensued, but we're hoping to sort of slowly figure it out. It's certainly something Cin-Ty's been working on for a year or so on the Texas coast as well. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Cin-Ty.
No, was just quite eye-opening. This gentleman, Shenjiang, sent this to us, and he identified it as a yellow-bellied, in fact, based on this long 6'5" gap, which is in volume 1, but the reviewers called it a Acadian. And yellow-bellied is considered rare, but then we decided, well, maybe we need to look at all of these photos, and it turned out, I don't know how many, 50 or so, and of yellow-bellies turned out to be were purged and leaving only 2 or 3 bona fide yellow-bellieds, and this being now one of them. So we've been learning a lot of stuff. And of course, yeah, in Texas, we had the reverse problem. Uh, I guess I can finish this one off.
Yeah.
This is a photo that I took myself. And actually, in the field, I did wonder, is this an Acadian or a yellow-bellied? It's quite pale below. It's a worn adult bird. And you might look at that and say, oh, that's an Acadian. And if you're in Texas in August along the coast, you might assume it's Acadian. But it turns out it is a yellow-bellied, and there you can see that long P6-5, and then after that you start to see the thin wing bar as Andy mentioned, the and some other features here. But uh, we decide also to look carefully at yellow-bellied and Acadian flycatchers in the fall in Texas, and Acadian is thought to be the default, but it turns out it's actually quite rare in the fall going south in Texas. And we think, and yellow bellies, they all go through Texas. So we think Acadians in the fall migrate through Florida, and the yellow bellies migrate through Texas, and they're incredibly rare in the southeast. But I'll turn it back to you, Andy. I think that
Sure.
might,
Yeah.
yeah, I'll let you close.
Yeah. What else? What's the next slide?
I think,
The
oh,
last.
here's another, this is a Acadian, yeah.
Oh yeah, so yeah, this is a good example of like just how yellow these hatch-ear Acadians can get. I think this is a bird that a lot of people might identify as a yellow-bellied. It's so yellow below, but there are a few features. There's the primary spacing on this bird, and the shape of the greater coverts. The pale tips on the greater coverts have a different shape on generally on Acadian versus yellow-bellied. And there's a number of birds similar to this. We can't necessarily see it on this photo, but there's some photos where if you see them on the front, yellow-belly tends to have its brightest, most saturated yellow in the very center of its chest, whereas Acadian tends to be a little more patchy or just generally more uniform. And often has quite a pale center to the breast. That's another feature. You could certainly argue on this Acadian here, it's sort of somewhat heavy build and got a bit of a sloping forehead. So those are perhaps other additional features that might be helpful. But generally, we do like to look at the structural feature of primary spacing as a good indicator of what species it likely is. The other thing just to note is there's not much of a dark secondary bar. I don't know if you can point that out with your laser pointer there. The secondary bar, a lot of these flycatchers will have a dark bar below those greater coverts. And yellow belly tends to have quite a large dark bar, and Acadian it's a bit more variable. But the fact that this bird doesn't have that also helps point towards it being likely an Acadian. And any more? Is that the last?
That's
There you
it.
go. Yeah, and that's our presentation. It's a lot to go through in sort of 55 minutes and totally understand it could be a little overwhelming, but hopefully it gives you at least a taste of the sorts of things that you need to be focusing on when one of these birds pops up in front of you. And like anything, it's practice. You have to look at a lot of these birds before you get a good sense of what they are.
Well, thank you
And
both so much. I learned I learned a lot, that's for sure. And I'm sure I have a lot more learning to do. I did not expect yellow-bellied and Acadian to be confusing, but those photos clearly showed me they can be.
It's funny, we also didn't think that they would be that confusing in our book. We underestimated how bad it was. So there's so many new things to learn. We're still learning, Andy and me.
Yes, sure. I will take questions. Those on Zoom, you can put it in the chat and I can read them out, or you can raise your hand and I'll call you out, and I'll take questions from the room as well. Art.
I have a couple of questions. One has to do with wing molt. Do all the empties follow about the same schedule for wing molt, and when during the year is it safe to assume that all of them have completed their wing molt?
Were you able to hear that?
I think you're gonna have to repeat it.
I was not able to hear it. I don't know if Andy could hear it.
I think I did. It was a question about do all the species follow the same molt schedule? I'm assuming that's as a sort of a question in terms of can molt be helpful in separating some of these flycatchers?
Or whether when can molt not be confusing?
Question
I
was,
mean,
when can
we assume that any empty that we're looking at has completed its wing molt? So any differences we see in primary projection or whatever are structural related to that species and not just happenstance because they haven't completed their wing mold.
Yeah, the question is, can you use the primary tip spacings when there's issues of molt, I think.
Yeah.
You know, fortunately, if you live in Mexico North, you're probably good in most cases because a lot of these flycatchers, they molt after they reach their wintering grounds, so down in Central America. And if you go down to Central America in the winter, you got to be careful. It's a mess. These birds really look messy when they're molting. Um, Now, Acadian does molt, we think, on the breeding grounds before it flies south. So you have to be careful with that. But it looks like they must molt very quickly. So by the time you see them moving through uh, down here, um, they're in very fresh plumage, both the juveniles or the hatchier birds and the adults. And you would probably only have problem in a 2 week window or so on the breeding grounds. So that would be in late July, early August.
Uh, can I come back to you, Art? Let's do a question on Zoom. Edge, I see you have a comment saying hand raise if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question.
So this is actually the third time I've seen this presentation, but this is the first time I've heard you mention the bar underneath the bar underneath the wing bar. Could you just say the term that you used for that?
A secondary bar.
Yes.
So it's
Thank
the dark, the secondaries, have those pale sort of white or yellowish edges. And on many species, sort of at the base of the feather, it's actually dark. That white pale edge doesn't go all the way to the base. It certainly is something that's usually fairly prevalent on yellow-bellied and a little more variable on Acadian.
Yeah, we didn't emphasize it that much in the book at the time, in particular between yellow-bellied and Western flycatcher. Andy illustrated, and we discussed it in the text. We didn't really talk that much about it for Acadian and yellow-bellied because we actually thought that pair was not something that would be a common source of confusion, but uh, we just started to realize that these fall birds are much more confusing than we realize. So yeah, it'll be in volume 3. We will add a few more things and all this primary tip spacing and measurements are in volume 3 that you may have seen little bits of it in previous talks. But we put new stuff in for you guys.
Yeah, if you're interested in reading more detail about the order willow, Western Field Ornithologists has that article. I don't think there's no paywall for their journal. So I think, it's from a few months, a couple of volumes ago, 2 or 3 volumes ago, you'll find that article in there if you want to read that in more detail, because that is not in volume 1, but will be in volume 3.
And one of the slides that we showed, the summary, it was very quick, but of all the primary tip spacings, this is the very first time we've shown it publicly. So you have it recorded.
Thank you. All right, you had another question?
Yes. Do any of the pewees have any yellow in the bill?
The question was, do any of the pewees have any yellow in the bill?
Yes, I mean, Easternwood pewee does. I mean, that's sort of one suggestive way to separate it from Westernwood pewee. Westernwood pewee tends to have quite a dark lower mandible, but Easternwood pewee can be quite yellowish all the way almost to the tip on some birds, but usually it's sort of bicolored with a slightly darker tip. And olive-sided, can have some color in its lower, often around the gape, have a little color.
Thank you. Question on Zoom from Nilesh. Is a photograph almost essential to tell these species apart?
No, I don't think so. I think the goal of volume one was to show you didn't have to actually come out with a ruler and measure all these things. If you use the holistic approach, I think you can get 80% of the way. I mean, identify 80 with practice, 80% of the birds. Obviously, willow and alder, that's a whole different beast. But for the other flycatchers or getting it down to trails, I don't think you need necessarily a super good photo. That being said, it helps. And even birders who are considered experts, including Andy and me, that we wrote the book, you'd be quite surprised how often you can be tricked. And there have been times where I took some photos and I was sure it was this species. Then I go home and I look at my photos and I'm like, oh my gosh, I messed up. So it's a good way to keep you honest.
Thank you. Any other questions from the room? Marty?
So I find in my local patch, I have difficulty, this might be unique to me, difficulty in telling eastern wood pewee apart from, say, willow alder. So a couple, I mean, if I see it in good light and it looks really vested, then I tend to assume pewee is more common. But in general, in that regard, is bill color worth much for identifying these birds? And what about behavioral aspects, like the way where they perch or fly or that?
Did you hear that?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. The question was about separating eastern wood pewee from, say, any other flycatcher or willow, etc. I'm less familiar with eastern. I see a lot of westerns, but I assume it's the same. I find behavioral is usually pretty good for me in terms of if I got like a very distant bird and I can barely see anything on it. A wood pewee, uh, typically will often fly out, catch something, and go land on the exact same branch, and it will do that over and over again. Now, it's not to say a willow flycatcher can't sit up high and do that, but these wood pewees are very faithful to like just coming back to the same spot, and then they'll move. They'll go to another branch or another tree, and they'll go out and do that again several times, and they come to the same spot each time, and so that can be super helpful. I don't think I've ever seen sort of a willow flycatcher do that repeatedly over and over. And then, yeah, generally, if you're looking at these things from below, wood pewees generally a little more dirty underneath, a little more vested. You can't necessarily see the primary projection from below. So that's sort of another good clue. But yes, when they're high up, I do find behavior is actually probably one of the easiest ways to separate them. Do you have any thoughts, Cin-Ty? I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe
No,
Eastern.
I agree 100%. I would just add, the would-be tend to be a photographer's dream. They just keep coming back to the same spot. So
Right.
easy to take photos of them. And sometimes alder's a mess. They duck right into the shrubs and it takes a while to get them out. So, and willow's similar.
Oh, thank you. Uh, Question from Zoom, from Victor. Victor says, fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Is there some understanding of why they all look so similar?
Who knows? I don't know, to give us hell, I suppose. I'm not sure. Um, well, I don't know if we, as humans, we have a bias, right? That we're very visual creatures, and so we think that what will separate species is, like the warblers or the wood warblers. It's really about colors and plumage patterns. But there are many other features that uh, they play a role in distinguishing birds. And in this case, their vocalizations are different, their habitat preferences are different. Um, the way they display is different than warblers. So while it seems very subtle, these colors, they may be very different in every other aspect. Even the way they nest is different. Some nest on the ground, believe it or not, in Empidonax. And some have these kind of bulbous nests like Acadian. So, but yeah, I don't know the answer, obviously, but there are many more ways than just color that can distinguish species.
Oh, thank you. Any other questions from the room? Marty?
When's volume 3 coming out?
When is volume 3 coming out?
Well, the rate limiting factor is us, and we have not turned it in yet. We're still working out, and we keep getting pulled into these rabbit holes, like the migration of yellow-bellied flycatchers in the southeast. And it's probably good we get pulled into them because we really want to get the maps. We want to get everything really right because volume 3 is the last one we're going to do. So, but the goal is probably to turn it in January, I hope. We'll see. And then usually it takes about a year after that before it comes out.
Well, I'm looking forward to volume 3. Any other questions on Zoom in the room? Oh, we have a question on Zoom. Tanya, do you ever plan to do a book on Central and South American flycatchers?
Well, I don't know if we haven't really talked about that. There are a lot of flycatchers, the biggest family, I think, in the world, certainly in the New World. There's some 400 or 500 of them. So I don't know at the level of detail that what Andy and I do, we'd probably never
Never finish.
But volume 3 will go down into northern Mexico and will include some birds that we just don't get up here, like white-throated flycatcher, greenish Elania, which has potential, is shown up in Texas. So that will cover some of those. But yeah, to answer your question about going further south, I don't know. I myself don't have intention yet. I don't know if Andy has thought about that, but
No, I mean, I think I need a break from flycatchers after I
that's
finish
right.
the volume. So I don't know that I can handle doing 400 or 500 more. We'll leave that challenge for the next generation.
That's right.
There's somebody who raised their hand on Zoom, but I don't see it now. Joe?
Somebody wants to know what's the painting on the easel. Some Caspian terns. And then I'm working on some sheep.
Nice.
When all else fails and flycatchers drive you nuts, sheep is the way to go.
I don't see any raised hands, but if you do, Joe, I think it was you who had your hand raised. If you want to unmute yourself and ask the question. Maybe not. All right. Anybody else in the room? All right.
I would say, just to sort of close it, I mean, we get this question a lot of like, okay, I've got photos of a flycatcher. What do I do? I don't really know what it is. I don't want to drive my eBird reviewer nuts. I mean, there are outlets. So Facebook has a Flycatchers of North America group that I think are fairly patient. I think, you can put your photos there. iNaturalist as well is a great place to put photos, and their AI model is actually quite good. It'll give you some good suggestions. It may not be the correct suggestion, but you will, I think, likely have other people chiming on. Both Cin-Ty and myself are on there from time to time. Certainly if you flag us, we can go take a look and help. If you're concerned about putting data into eBird that you're worried may not be correct, there are the sort of frontline defenses that you can use to try and make sure you feel good about your ID.
And you can always reach out to both of us if you have questions.
Yeah, Naveen has our email. You can forward messages.
All right, thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks.